Unbiased information.
Honest and forthright.
News without the misinformation.
It doesn't matter what side you're from. What matters is what you say, the truthfulness behind it.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to the Johnny VEDMORE Show. On today's News Talk TNT, I'm here with a very special guest, someone who I've only met recently on a few times. I've been on the Muckrakers and I've loved meeting him. He's such a very interesting person, got an amazing background, especially interesting to hear his views because he was once on the mainstream. And Andrew Eborn, our very own muckraker himself. How are you today, sir?
I am incredibly well. You say I was once on the mainstream. I dance on more platforms than Paddington, so no, I do work on the BBC and Times and Sky and various other things. But what I love about TNT is that we have time to unpack all the really, really serious issues, give it much more time, and also talk about issues that a lot of people are not talking about. And that's what I love about it. But I can bring both the mainstream experience and other experiences as well.
Yeah, that's why I really like the idea that you find you see the benefit of a platform like TNT. But a lot of the mainstream media would probably detest such a platform because it's a type of competition where they don't get to control the narrative. Do you think that's something that they try and do now?
Well, it is. I've never been told what to say or what to do, and I get booked on all sorts of shows. So I think the great thing, and as I say, the great thing that we can do with TNT is unpack a lot of those issues that people don't have the time to normally unpack. And I know it's not everybody's favourite word, but from a journalistic point of view, it means we're doing a deep dive into those key issues. And you've been brilliant. I've loved having you on the Muckrakers, and we've had some great guests from around the world. And what we've looked at are things we don't normally shine a spotlight. We've looked at 9/11 again there, and all that sort of side. We've looked at, obviously, Julian Assange's case, and we've been one of the very few advocates since the very beginning, if you like, of the Muckrakers on the 20th of May, just a few weeks ago, talking about Julian's case and following the trials and tribulations of that. And what I love about it, we can ask those questions. We go a bit deeper than just regurgitating everybody's own beliefs and actually question everything. And I think the whole idea of this sort of stuff, it's an informed debate. And what I love about your brilliant audience on TNT, that they want to ask those questions, and we want to make sure they've got an audience. And I love hearing the different views. Some of them are physically impossible, the suggestions, but what I love are those sort of things. So everybody's entitled to a voice, and what I always say is that on the Muckrakers, we give people that platform to air those views.
Talking about airing views, I mean, this is a very pertinent point with the Julian Assange case, because obviously we work within the press and we report. We're talking here about reporting on things, and you've had that. I would say it's possibly lucky experience. You've been accepted on the mainstream and not given instructions on what you can or can't talk about. But not everybody gets that, and freedom of speech is really, it's becoming more and more refined, defined, until eventually it won't be there anymore. What do you think the implications of Assange's plea deal and the basic Assange case will have on freedom of speech?
Oh, well, I think I've been, as I say, a big advocate for Julian for a very long time, and it's absolutely essential. And there's a big difference between being a publisher, which is what Julian was, and somebody who is stealing the secrets, the sort of Chelsea Manning sort of situation. And it's always important to look at that situation. It became so politically charged in terms of this is what's going to happen with Julian. There was all sorts of accusations thrown at him, so he might have to appear in a Swedish court. The reality is, from a personal point of view, life for Julian has been absolutely miserable. He spent, 14 years trying to work this all out, whether in terms of the Ecuadorian embassy, where he was in confinement there effectively, to 5 years in Belmarsh prison. And he's just been released this week, as your show goes out. It's basically, he's just been released. And yesterday he sort of arrived in Australia, and he'd formalised his plea agreement with the US in the federal court on Mariana Island. And basically what it said is that rather than facing all these 18 charges, if he pled guilty to just one, then they basically let him off for the other 17, and they would sentence him for just that one, but because he'd already been in prison for 5 years, 1,901 days, I think it was, what will happen is that time will be taken into account, and therefore he could be a free man. And what I love seeing, the really good thing I love seeing, was all of the fantastic pictures of him, his wife, and so on and so forth, being reunited with the family. From a personal point of view, that is fantastic. The difficulty I've got is what the plea bargain meant. Because the plea bargain meant by pleading guilty to that one charge, there's then that conflict between the Espionage Act, which he's now pled guilty to, and freedom of speech. And I always say about plea bargains is the whole idea is you should never, ever, ever agree to anything. Never plead guilty if you're not guilty. And he always maintains that he was an innocent man. And the consequences of that means that other journalists will now be subjected to the same sort of problems. We've also heard about he's had to pay for his own flight. There's all sorts of questions about this deal. And the figures I've seen were a staggering 500,000. He's getting money from all sorts of sources to help pay for that, and also to help pay for his basically reinstatement, if you like, both as a person to recuperate following his tremendous ordeal. But why he would have to pay his own 500,000, hopefully that will have to come out, because effectively that's like another fine, like $500,000 fine for that, as well as having this criminal conviction. And that's what we need to look at, is in real terms, what does that mean for journalists? Because others would also then basically be in a similar sort of situation.
Yeah, I know that if I was being persecuted and I finally got out of such custody after 5 years in prison, I would not be able to raise £500,000. I know that most journalists who will be persecuted don't have the profile that Assange has got. So do you think this is only possible, and this sort of case is only possible because Julian Assange has such a high profile in the first place?
Well, I think what's fascinating is we've advocated, and Julian's got some fantastic supporters, and quite rightly too, who turn around and say, look, you've got to listen to him. It's about freedom of the press. The information and the corruption and the murder that he exposed was of tremendous value. But more than anybody, he did more than anybody, I would say, in the past 20 years to expose US crimes to a world saturated in propaganda, obscuring them. So the whole thing about that sort of side is really, really important. My concern, as I said beforehand, is basically look at what does that mean now between the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the US espionage. And it was interesting what the judge said. I mean, the judge said, with this pronouncement, it appears that you'll be able to walk out of this courtroom a free man. Well, from a personal point of view, that's absolutely right. Julian, he issued a statement, I'll read it to you. It says, working as a journalist, I encourage my source to provide information that was said to be classified. I believe the First Amendment protected that activity, but I accept that it was a violation of the espionage statute. He then goes on to say that the First Amendment was in contradiction with the Espionage Act, but I accept that it would be difficult to win such a case given all these circumstances. In other words, what he's saying, he said he broke the law, but as the law is written, it's wrong. And the problem that I've got, Johnny, is that means we're not going to have that day in court and turn around and say, actually, let's get that clarified so that other journalists continue to hold people's feet to the fire, which is so very, very important. The other difficulty I've got with the case is as well what's going to happen, because it's the timing. And to me, we've got an election, as you know, it's July the 4th in the UK, and it's November the 5th in the US. I always say it's fireworks on both sides of the Atlantic, so it's turning around to our special relationship extends to fireworks for the elections. But Trump himself was talking about that he was giving serious consideration to pardoning Julian. Now, if that had happened, he wouldn't need to have done this deal. So I have lots of questions about the timing. I have lots of questions about the other bits and pieces, and having a look at that, because this is the first time ever that a journalist has basically been charged successfully under the Espionage Act. And you might remember there's been a number of cases where they tried to do that beforehand. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, I think, was the Justice Department. They failed to get a grand jury's indictment against the Chicago Tribune back in 1943. And Richard Nixon also attempted to indict the New York Times reporters for the Pentagon Papers. And that fell apart after the prosecutorial misconduct. And they were looking at all sorts of things and medical records and various other things in the case against Daniel Ellsberg. So I would urge people to look again at those cases and what does this deal mean to them? The other difficulty I've got as well, Johnny, is that part of the deal, as we understand, is that documents, everything that WikiLeaks was given, basically Julian has signed or basically has to confirm that they're going to be destroyed, and he's instructed that. And the thing about a plea deal is that if you need to understand what happens, like any contract, a plea deal, if you break that plea deal, then effectively you could end up back where you started. So he could end up being subject to those 18 charges. He could end up with a potential 175 years in jail if he were to breach that plea deal. So I have lots and lots of questions and lots of concerns. But as I say, from a personal point of view, I'm delighted for Julian and his family, and absolutely I wish him so well for the future.
Completely agree with you about the concerns. Completely agree with you also about wishing him well for the future and his family. We're going to come back after a short news break. You're listening to today's News Talk TNT.
Hi, I'm Susan Lucci. I never thought about heart disease until I had my own heart event. I had a 90% blockage in my main artery and a 75% blockage in the adjacent artery. I received 2 stents in my arteries. Stents developed through research funded by the American Heart Association. Those stents saved my life. Learn more about the American Heart Association's life-saving work at helpheart.org.
The human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it.
That's a campaign promise.
Tell us the truth. Tell us the truth.
We mandate that the truth be told.
You're hearing it.
TNT.
Welcome back to the Johnny Vedmore Show on today's News Talk TNT. I'm here with the great Andrew Eborn, who has a very good take on most things, that's for sure, and I really like hearing your perspective, Andrew. Now, one question that I had that keeps rolling around in my head is, surely, if Trump gets into office, which is probably likely in the American elections, surely he could still give a full pardon to Julian Assange.
Oh, absolutely. Well, he might start with himself. I mean, you've got his.
You don't think he's going to pardon Hunter Biden as well, do you?
Well, you say that politically, Donald Trump is the master media manipulator, and I've always predicted when people went to bed and said Hillary's won, I predicted that Donald was going to win it because there's a half of America so supports him, and the reason pollsters flubbed so spectacularly is people tend not to admit it. Sometimes, when asked a particular question, they don't want to admit their views. So with Donald's case, I predicted that he would win, and what happened? Everybody went to bed, you might recall, thinking, "Oh, Hillary stormed this." They woke up, and here's Donald. And I think you work on that sort of basis. He could have scored some major political kudos, turning around with all the court cases he's going on with him, and he could have turned around and said, well, actually, the first thing I'm going to do as president is pardon Hunter Biden. He can then control the narrative. And the thing about the media, it's all about controlling the narrative, because then that puts the onus back on Biden. If he were to get back in, to turn around, we'll say, hang about, we should look after Donald as well. So interesting one on that sort of stuff. But you're right, he could pardon Julian. The difficulty I've still got, it still doesn't leave the question answered. He would still be a convict, or he still would have been convicted, but you then get the pardon, and it still leaves that grey area between the First Amendment and the Espionage Act, which means that still the Espionage Act trumps that, and the First Amendment doesn't help.
Yeah, and I think they prefer having a grey area rather than it being black and white. That's for sure. The people in power love a little bit of grey to confuse everything. That's for sure. On the question of Donald Trump and that election that comes into my mind, I see him as at least designing himself and putting himself forward as one of the great peacemakers. He tried that with North Korea when he was in office, and of course the whole establishment was against him, it seemed, and it allowed him to both look like he was against the establishment and that he was a peacemaker. Do you think that when he takes office, if he takes office, I will say that, if he takes office, that he will do the same with Russia?
I'll tell you what, and I've spoken extensively around the world on this as well. I think Putin, if you say, well, who's Putin more scared of, Biden or Trump? And I can tell you that the answer is Trump, without a doubt. And so Trump is more likely to be able to secure some sort of peace deal. And I think part of that peace, I was, the popular character, I was with Michael Gove earlier this week, asking him all sorts of questions, holding people's feet to the fire. And I asked him, look, what are we going to do? People talk on all sides about how horrible war is, and they always advocate one side or the other. What we want to advocate is peace. And what we always try and look for on TNT here is the truth in order to help people get to that peace. And what we're sort of saying is, okay, well, look, we need to recognise what is the situation in Ukraine. And what they're basically saying is they don't want them to be part of the NATO. So we need to look at that sort of side. And the rest of it then is a geographical side. You need to work out why also is this war taking place. And there's all sorts of areas rich in minerals and everything else. And what happens is the first casualty in war is firstly the truth. But secondly, it's lost in lives, but also huge amounts of money is at stake. So you've got to question why these wars are taking place. And so often it's about the economic side, so often it's about the geopolitical and other bits and pieces as well. And I had some brilliant guests on as well, they'd basically look at the alternatives to war. What can you do? How can you win without war is the name of their organisation. And we unpacked that. Firstly, understanding that history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history. But secondly, to turn around and say, look, let's talk about things. Jaw, not war. And get those educated discussions. What's going to find peace? And that's what I loved about that sort of stuff. So I put that to Michael Gove, and we're going to be probably having him on a programme on TNT, on the Muckrakers in the not too distant future. But what I would also urge, Johnny, and it's so important, is so many people, a lot of I'm bringing lots of people from the mainstream to talk to TNT as well, but it's important. We need to have the people at the table in order to have those sensible discussions. So you can put your questions directly to them, you can make sure that their voices are heard, but you can also make sure your voice in response to those voices is echoed equally loudly, because that's the only way we can get things solved. It's by informed discussion, informed debate, and sensible discussions on those key issues.
I totally agree with you, and I find that a lot of the debate is controlled by people who don't want to have debates, and that tends to be the process that censorship takes. And censorship often is self-censorship. It's fear of speaking to the other side and saying something wrong. So a lot of people avoid speaking to the other side, and I completely agree with that. On the last point, do you think there would be a better way, and I know this would be a controversial and probably one of the biggest changes in global society, but do you think there's a better way to draw national boundaries and borders than what's currently happening? Because isn't really like the Eastern Ukraine conflict reminiscent of that of the Sudetenland or others, where the language and the culture was of one country, while the other country with a different language and culture actually ruled that area? Isn't that one of the main problems?
Oh yeah, without doubt. I think it's a misunderstanding of both sides. I think people make the biggest mistake that they live in this sort of vacuum, if you like, and they only we live in a very diseased information age. We basically surround ourselves with people who share our own views. We only listen to channels which promote those views, and we basically just continue to repeat exactly our own side. And what I always urge everybody to do is firstly to question everything. We need to get information from many different sources, not least TNT. Because between all those different sources, the truth lies. And if you understand what the truth is, what the real issues are, you're much better and more likely to find a solution. And the other thing I hate, Johnny, is as well labels. And one of the things that anytime if you talk about Gaza, you're pro-Gaza, pro-peace, one of the labels that throw you is being an anti-Semite. Now, that's unfair. If people, what they're saying, not necessarily anti-Semite, and there's some horrible things that are said, and they should be called out. But if people are trying to look for peace, what they are, they're not trying to take either side. They're trying to turn around and say, war is devastating on both sides. What we need to do is fight together in order to find that peace and to help find a solution.
Do you think we create our own echo chambers, or are the echo chambers created for us?
Oh, I think we're very tribal. Human nature is very tribal, whether it's your football team and interesting what is going on in the Euros, works on that sort of basis. Talk about history repeating itself. You work on that sort of principle. No, we are tribal, and it's human nature. So we tend to, birds of a feather flock together, and you peddle that same narrative. And the trouble is we're in a very divided age. I've often said the best thing about Joe Biden, and maybe the best thing, is that his name is an anagram of what is the best thing in this divided age, because he could basically say be joined. Be joined is the anagram of Joe Biden, and if he could be the peacemaker, then I think he'd have a lot going for him. I've yet to see a lot of evidence of that, but it's interesting on that sort of principle.
And not to start towards the end of this interview on a negative note, but do you really think that we're aiming for peace here, or are we heading towards something that looks more like World War III?
I think we are in such dangerous territory, and it's something that we've touched on. It is scary how close we are to World War III, and we need to wake up to that particular side. Understanding what happens where things like the planes, the F-16 planes, it's not a question of giving those to Ukraine, for example. They can only be flown by somebody who's been trained for an extensive period of time, and those could only be NATO pilots. As soon as this information becomes apparent, we're already putting NATO troops and so on and so forth in this sort of conflict. It is incredibly dangerous. We need to focus our efforts and really urgently on trying to find a peaceful solution. I do think peace is there. I do think what can happen is we can make sure that every side is willing to have that discussion, but to understand and to listen to both sides' concerns so that we can reach that sensible solution.
In the last, say, 30 seconds we got here, 45, 30 seconds, can you tell me what would be the best way to get to peace then?
Well, the best way to get to peace is to sit everybody down in the same table. We had the so-called peace summit about Ukraine, and the crazy thing is Putin wasn't even invited. So how that could be a discussion doesn't make sense. So we unpacked that on the Muckrakers. But there was suggestion that he would be invited to a future one. So let's get that going. Jaw, not war. I think is so essential. Let's talk to other people. Let's get some good people who can get them round a table and find those solutions.
Yeah, I look forward to the moment where people can sit round tables and have conversations. Thank you, Andrew Eborn. You're an amazing man. I love your positivity, and I love how you are. It's awesome, and all the best with the Muckrakers. I'll probably see you next week, I'm sure.
Johnny Vedmore on today's News Talk TNT.
Welcome back to the Johnny Vedmore Show on today's News Talk TNT. And I am joined again by Andrew Eborn, who hasn't left yet. I'm quite glad about that. And Ruckus is coming along too for the ride, because I always love to have his view in here too, especially the American view on what we're going to talk about next, because we can talk about the British election. Of course, the general election is less than a week away. So to start off, Ruckus, what do you think of the British election over there? How do the people in the States see this election? Do they even know it's going on?
You know what? Nice to meet you, Andrew. It's kind of like a little mini
Ruckus.
We'll call this a mini Muckrakers with Ruckus. How about that with Johnny and
a mini
and Andrew
Ruckmakers? Yeah, absolutely.
This is great. I think you're onto something, Johnny. I think out in America they don't really talk about politics the way that I know out there. They talk about American politics because, for whatever reason, the American exceptionalism has spread to the rest of the world. So I get the impression when I'm doing news sourcing from like British papers or from RT, there's a lot of everyone talks about American politics, especially when it's a big election like the president coming up. Sometimes you hear them weighing in on like the Congress stuff if it's a big a ground battle fight over Georgia, for instance, back in 2022. So you see that, but Americans, they have no clue what's going on in that other side of the pond, as I was intimating earlier in the first hour, Johnny. The thing is that it's so complicated. I barely have my head wrapped around American politics, but it's kind of simple in general because you got the Congress, you got the Senate, we have just like the two bodies, and we got the presidents, and everybody just looks at these figureheads. Whereas out there, each one of the people who are involved, from what I can tell, in the parliament, everyone knows these people. They're all superstars. They're all very important. They're very all hands-on, and it's very entertaining to watch because I don't know what that is that I'm seeing on TV sometimes when they're starting to fight and argue and they're slapping on the desk and cheering, hurrah, huzzah. It's like a medieval festival to me when I'm watching it sometimes, Johnny. So yeah, us Americans are absolutely clueless Yanks, unfortunately. I don't mean to speak for all Americans, but most of us, sadly.
But I'll tell you what, right? I love American politics. Same sort of thing. We love the what we call the Punch and Judy show with Biden and Trump. And Trump is one of those sort of charismatic characters. And I think politics is missing personalities. We have Nigel Farage over here, and whatever your views are about him, he certainly knows how to tap into the general populace. And Trump is the same. And the way Trump does it is, as I said beforehand, he's a master media manipulator. The more you throw at him, the more his popularity increases. And you can say, I'm going to put him in jail for zillions of years, and he'll keep going because he would tell people that they're going to come after me, and they're coming after me, they're coming after you. And as a result of his popularity is through the roof, isn't it?
Yeah. Do you think Andrew, know too much about American politics? Do you think, because over the past 10, 15 years, we've really seen a much more of a rise in coverage in the UK press on American issues? Do you think that's done on purpose so that they can sort of shove a lot of British politics under the carpet and have an excuse to keep us watching the soap opera that's going on across the Atlantic?
I think you make an excellent point. I think it is a soap opera. I think that the real problem is nobody really dives into the issues. It's all about sound bites, isn't it? The last election here in the UK was all done on get Brexit done. That's what they were sort of saying. And I think if you understand the press at the moment, it looks as though Starmer might have to get Brexit undone. That's what he's trying to say. So it's about sound bites. And what I love about TNT is we can do those deep dives into the policy so people can understand the issues. And I think a lot of politicians actually treat the electorate with disrespect. The electorate's much more intelligent than they give them credit for. They do understand the issues. If you tell people, look, we need to put the taxes here in order to pay for this, and you put that on 2 pieces of paper, they'd understand it. But all these promises of, the Labour's going to cost you an extra $2,000 and there's a 38 billion hole and all this sort of stuff, these figures are staggering, but unless you break it all down and explain it in detail, it's absolutely there. But looking at going back to the UK, there's 2 different sides, aren't there? I mean, basically, Sunak has turned around, and it's Project Fear for him, because fear is basically, as Edward Bernays, the father of PR, says, it's the biggest, greatest human emotion. And the way you can get anybody to do anything is through fear. So he's turning around and saying, look, we're basically now making progress at long last. Inflation is down from 11% when it was way, way high. It's now 2% here, as I predicted. What's going to happen? We're on track. And if you change course now, you're going to lose that momentum. Now, the other side is Sir Keir Starmer, yet again, he's turning around and saying, well, change, which is not a trans joke. He's just turning around and saying, this is what you've got to do. We've had 14 years of the Tories. It's been turmoil with the Tories. We need to basically change in order to make that progress. But it is extraordinary. And if you look at them going head to head in the debates, it's pathetic, quite frankly. The level of debate is appalling. They're not really answering the issues. And I think that the electorate deserves better.
Well, going over from Andrew the Muckraker over to Adam the Ruckmaker, do you think that we're slowly joining poles? Do you think America and Britain are becoming basically, as technology increases, we're able to communicate easier, we're able to fly easier, and all of these travel will be much quicker in the future? Do you think we're basically still the same country?
Well, now, that's an interesting question, because, I mean, America is like, we broke off from the UK, what was that, 200, I don't want to do the 40-something because I was born at the 200 mark in 1976, and that would give away my age, but yeah, almost 250 years ago now. Oh, my goodness, yikes, that's frightening. But yeah, there's this... Here's for example, an interesting observation is to me that we write the same words. We both use English, but it's different. For instance, you guys use S instead of Z in some words, but it's still the same. I look at the politics and everything else, the culture, similarly. I mean, if it wasn't for the United Kingdom, America would be nothing, right? So we all come primarily from there, although America here as a country is certainly a huge, probably one of the largest melting pots of various peoples and cultures and where they come from. But the country in general was born out of England. So you can't really ultimately, at the end of the day, separate the two. I hear this stuff in the news about how Israel is our greatest ally. That is a talking point that has only come up recently in my lifetime. Until then, it was always the UK. It was always like our greatest ally was always, we're best friends. We're buddies. We're like besties with Britain. That's at least the world I was raised in here in America. But again, that narrative has changed. Apparently now Israel is our bestie. Go figure.
Yeah, and it takes a long time to actually get to a road to peace, to be perfectly honest, because we're all so primed to argue and fight with each other all of the time. And unfortunately, that seems to be the way it is. Listen, you guys, yes, I would love to have a conversation with the American and British perspective more often. Thank you both for joining me on this last part of the show. I really appreciate it. And Andrew, you can go back to muckraking, and Adam, you can go back to ruck making.
Sounds like a plan. I do that every day, my friend.
It's a wonderful plan.
Nice to meet you, Andrew.
Awesome. Now, thank you all for joining me for another day on the Johnny Vedmore Show. It's been brilliant. Thanks to my guest today, of course, Andrew Eborn and Debbie Evans. And thanks to, of course, Ruckus, who's always there helping out whenever needed. To the chatters in there, I've been in there with you too. And I love you as always. Up next is the one and only Mark Morano Show. So stay tuned. Remember, my friends, stay safe, stay awake, don't go changing. And thanks for being with me. See you again next week on today's News Talk TNT.